formula.
So many popular characters have already been utilized in these movies that to go back to the original First Class, we had to resort to a bunch of second stringers and nobodies. We got to the point where one of the most recognizable characters left to mind was Alex Summers, Cyclops' little brother, but now he's, I guess, his older brother? Guess we've hammered one more nail into that coffin. Might as well have called this movie Cyclops Shaft 5: The Revenge. The following is an in-depth analysis. If you haven't seen this film, you might want to before watching this review. X-Men First Class is one of the most interesting superhero movies, in that it makes a lot of really counterintuitive narrative and conceptual decisions necessitated by pre-established continuity, then totally contradicts other established continuity and creates an incredibly awkward timeline. And yet it tells a bold, dense, and complex story with a dissection of opposing philosophies about evolutionary superiority and survival of the fittest, versus peaceful cohabitation that rival the one in X2. Almost every role is well cast. The visual effects are stunning, the atmosphere is fresh, it juggles a large ensemble cast 5 times better than its most recent 2 bloated predecessors, and it chugs along just fine without the constant presence of Wolverine, who only appears for a brief F-bomb cameo. I've never seen a movie that's simultaneously so technically solid and delightfully thoughtful, and then maddeningly contrary to what your average fan of the source material would have wanted. This is a great example of a movie that on its own is masterful storytelling despite its departure from the work it's based on. X-Men First Class is far better than it has any right to be, and that's because it focuses on the relationship that's at the core of X-Men's primary themes, Professor X and Magneto, 2 sides of the same coin, and in this movie the coin is literal. First Class is a prequel, like many prequels, that suffers from too much muddled continuity, but makes up for it in being less about cutely showing us where all this stuff started, like I'd argue X-Men Origins Wolverine was doing, and instead examines the ins and outs of the mutant debate in the most comprehensive way it's been done on screen to date. First Class is a simple alternate history story with a fun, manageable terrorist plot about evil mutants manipulating the US and Russia into the Cuban Missile Crisis, with a whole lot more going on beneath its surface. I'll be the first to admit that when I learned X-Men First Class was going to get made, I was immediately let down in learning it wasn't a reboot, because that meant we weren't going to see the original comic book First Class. And how could we? Jean Grey and Cyclops are adults in the other films, and Iceman and Angel are teenagers about half their age. The only original member that could conceivably be used, and who has said he was an early X-Man in X3, is Beast. So, at least we have that. I remember seeing X-Men for the first time and thinking, so Iceman's a kid? I guess that means we'll never see the original 5 X-Men in action, but I never dreamed anyone would get in their head to do a movie about the original X-Men despite that, and just pick a bunch of obscure mutants because too much of the roster's been picked through in the other 4 movies. And that might have been an absolute disaster if it weren't for the inspired choice to make the main dual protagonists Charles Xavier and Eric Lehnsherr. Despite already knowing how these 2 men turn out in the future, the pair that build a profound friendship that's doomed to fail because of a fundamental difference in ideology is a story as old as time, and it's always potentially a great source for drama and character study. When X-Men Origins Wolverine was announced, there were plans for an X-Men Origins Magneto film. When that never came to fruition, this project was greenlit instead, and it's a pretty fantastic compromise. It accomplishes everything I would have wanted to see in a Magneto film, but by broadening the prequel out to allow Xavier to also have his story told, my favorite X-Men character and another who I always felt was written out of every X-Men movie as soon as humanly possible, it becomes a story not just about a man who becomes the bad guy, but about 2 friends who are forced to choose sides against each other. So naturally, besides Beast, these weren't the mutants I was looking for, but since it isn't their story so much as Charles and Eric's, it's a compromise I quickly learned to live with. If we couldn't have a straight-up reboot, and a lot of interesting viewpoints on mutation and prejudice were explored with some of those characters too. I'm actually glad a lot of characters were used in the other films before this movie was made, otherwise we might have ended up with the First Class consisting of Lady Deathstrike, Blob, Siren, Deadpool, and Beast. Each of the members of this new First Class, I think, is a deliberate counterpart to the original, with the exception of Darwin, who's just there to get killed off. Beast is, of course, Beast, though he looks a lot different. This one seems based more on the design from Whedon's Astonishing X-Men, while Kelsey Grammer's X3 Beast was more traditional, and that's ironic given that that film was partially based on Astonishing X-Men. We've got Havoc instead of Cyclops, another Summers, another guy who shoots red energy blasts of some kind, and another character who, despite being the natural choice to lead the team, is the least developed of them. Mystique is, I think, Jean Grey's replacement. Both are loosely tragic female characters who work very closely with and befriend Charles Xavier, then in one way or another embrace the dark side and end up working with Magneto, at least in this continuity. Angel is a really strange case. She's clearly a stand-in for Angel, which is already bizarre. I can't believe there are two X-Men characters both with that moniker. But she's ultimately not an X-Man because she sides with Shaw almost immediately. If she wasn't actually going to be Angel's replacement, I'm not sure why she was put in the movie. Yeah, the story needs mutants to choose sides, but I mean, why a mutant named Angel specifically? The only thing Angel and her, I guess, comic book counterpart have in common besides the wings is they both turn to the dark side in some way, like Jean and Mystique, as comic book Angel eventually becomes Archangel, one of the four horsemen of Apocalypse, though of course the Angel from X-Men 3 doesn't get time to do much of anything. So that makes Banshee kind of a fill-in for both Angel and Iceman. He takes to the air like Angel, but he's boyish and cocksure around girls like Iceman. If Angel had stayed with the team, there would be 5 original members besides Xavier and Magneto. As it is, we only really have 4 by the end. When the movie was released, a lot of fans found glaring continuity errors with the other films they couldn't resolve, and some people made the leap that this must be a complete reboot and not a prequel. That logic has since been defeated by the development of X-Men Days of Future Past, which will essentially be both a sequel to First Class and X-Men 4 simultaneously, and will mix both casts via a time travel device. Bryan Singer, who co-wrote this movie and is directing that one, has said, if I'm not mistaken, that part of his goal with Days of Future Past is to clear up some of that muddled continuity, and so some of the mistakes I'm going to address might be nullified by the time that movie comes out. But let's take a look at them anyway. I believe that the same basic plot could have been achieved with a reboot, including the original 5 comic book X-Men, although some fans may have not appreciated those characters being so far in the background in favor of the Professor X Magneto story. The biggest difficulty in swallowing this movie with the others is that it's a period piece. Had this been a reboot, the whole franchise could have stemmed from this and been told as an alternate history piece throughout time. But by putting some of the characters we're already familiar with back in the early 60s, a lot of characters are suddenly far younger than they should be by the first X-Men movie. And is this supposed to be Storm? Yes, the original trilogy is set in the not-too-distant future, and so the time is somewhat ambiguous, but it's counter to the spirit of those movies to suddenly place this world in a historical context, despite the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Cold War at large being an inspired metaphor for Xavier and Magneto's lifelong conflict. I also love that if this had to be a period piece, at least it's set so close to when the original X-Men comics debuted, a really nice homage to the history of the brand. This film takes place in 1962, and X-Men #1 came out in 63. Technically, they don't even call themselves X-Men until Moira comes up with it at the very end, a riff on G-Men from when they worked for the government. So the proper X-Men in this universe probably actually reveal themselves to the world in the year 1963. I think that's fun. I suppose I can buy Magneto and Xavier's ages by X-Men, which, regardless of the attempt at making the time period ambiguous, kinda now has to be set in or around 2000, once this movie places these guys in their mid to late 20s in 1962. But let's assume Havoc is still Cyclops' brother, as it would be ridiculous coincidence to have 2 X-Men over time named Summers with such similar powers. But is now the older brother, what, are they 30 to 35 years apart in age? Because by the first X-Men movie, Scott sure looks like he was born well after 1962. And what about Mystique? Does her shape-shifting ability allow her not to age? She certainly aged at a normal rate from a little girl to a teenager, and we know she's got more aging left to do. I suppose she could be in her 50s in the first X-Men movies, and we never see her fully aged form, but that clearly was not the intention before. I'm thinking this out more than an average audience probably would, but it's distracting for me because it's contrary to the original logic of keeping the timeline more ambiguous. The first 3 movies did a fairly decent job of making few technological or cultural references so that the movies would feel present day, but not necessarily the year they were produced, so that for any age we watched them in, we could at least imagine them as taking place in the not-too-distant future. And this kind of wrecks all that. Xavier said in the first film that Magneto helped him build Cerebro. Here, Hank does that all by himself. In Origins, Professor X has a cameo and he's standing on 2 legs. Maybe he got them repaired, but how or why does he wind up in a wheelchair again? And certainly there are other examples. It just seems strange to hold to the original movie continuity, but then also blatantly contradict it at the same time. The best prequels, arguably, inform and flesh out characters in a world we've seen the future of, but tell standalone narratives that don't necessitate prior knowledge to understand it. After all, from the perspective of the characters in this film, this would be the first adventure. It really needs to work on that level. I think First Class absolutely does that, and so a newcomer wouldn't have any of that baggage I did and felt the need to spend several minutes talking about. Sometimes I wonder if I'd enjoy superhero films more if I didn't know anything about them. On this viewing, I watched this with my 14-year-old sister-in-law, who doesn't know the X-Men films well at all, and had zero trouble understanding or enjoying what she was seeing. It's a testament to the competency of the storytelling that so many fans wanted this to be a reboot. If people thought it worked on that level, that means they saw it as a fresh start, despite how informed it is by what came before. And while that did limit what it could borrow from early X-Men lore, story developers Bryan Singer and Sheldon Turner took the opportunity to create some unexpected and fascinating character dynamics that would probably never have been conceived without the previous installments. For example, it would never have occurred to me to pair up Beast and Mystique and put them in a love triangle with Magneto, and for me, that's one of the more captivating subplots in the film. On the surface, the only things Mystique and Beast seem to have in common is they're both mutants, their outward appearance is affected by their mutation, and they're both blue. And the film is smart enough to take advantage of any and all bizarre coincidences. The fact that they're both blue is actually a big story point. I like that they're romantically interested in each other from the beginning, because they both have to hide from the outside world. Both want to be considered normal, which is a common enough reason for teenagers to become attracted to one another, and Beast isn't blue and furry from the beginning, so it doesn't goofily come off like they're into each other because they both have the same unusual skin tone. But there's enough evidence, though smartly the movie never comes right out and confirms this, that Hank maybe becomes blue because it's Mystique's genetic code he uses to make his serum. What a clever way to handle Hank's transformation, too. It makes perfect sense that Mystique's physiology might hold the key to making a mutant look normal, although the business about changing their appearance but not their powers makes zero sense in Hank's case. One of his abilities is that his feet have opposable digits, so he can grab onto things with them, and clearly he can't do that anymore once his feet are normal. Anyway, in observing an unintended trait both of these characters have in common, a natural relationship forms, and through it, a natural paralleling dual character arc. Mystique and Beast's relationship runs adjacent to Charles and Eric's, but importantly, it's not the same thing, and that allows the movie to explore new territory rather than spend the entire movie watching 4 characters making the exact same arguments we've already seen Charles and Eric making in 3 movies prior. The Mutant Dilemma was always a metaphor for puberty in the comics, so it's a great choice to depict 2 characters who come to different conclusions about that in their teenage years, when they're not sure who or what they want to be. Mystique doesn't start off on the opposite spectrum from Beast. She hates the slogan mutant and proud that a girl with the groovy mutation of heterochromia comes up with in a bar at the beginning, and thanks to Eric himself, she comes to adopt that slogan for her own when she finally decides there's nothing wrong with her and she should embrace her differences. And that's a great use narratively of a repeated phrase. I also like that her powers reflect her characterization. The woman with the power of change undergoes the most change, and poetically, what she comes to realize is that she shouldn't have to change at all if she doesn't want to. Beast, up until the end, is actually the more extreme of these two, and he's the unchanging one. He sides with Xavier at the end against Mystique and Magneto, not because he believes in cohabitation with humankind necessarily, and unfortunately, until X3, there won't be a we don't want to be mutants anymore camp in between the live peacefully with humans and humans totally suck camps. The Jekyll-Hyde allegory, while obvious, is an apt one, because Hank tries to change his nature and ends up paying for it by getting more of precisely the opposite of what he wanted. He started off looking human, but having to hide his feet. He ends up not being able to hide anything. Mystique quickly becomes a crusader for the mutant cause, because having to hide all the time makes her life incredibly difficult. I like the scene where Eric illustrates how much concentration it takes her to keep a human-looking form by distracting her while she's working out. She and Hank, at the beginning, both see their mutations as handicaps, and their opinions are defined somewhat by their individual challenges. Until humanity accepts Beast's physical differences, which he can't change just by thinking about it like Raven can, they'll always be seen as a handicap by someone. whereas it's easier for Mystique to change her tune because accepting her true form is liberating for her. It's too difficult to use her powers 100% of the time. Just as with Eric and Charles, neither Mystique or Beast is completely right or completely wrong. All four of them make sacrifices and pay for their respective beliefs. And that's how you write a story that pulls the curtain back to reveal all these different perspectives without trying to make up the audience's mind as to which ethical view is the right one. Of course, the movie does kill off Shaw, but his view is basically the same as Hitler's, so I think most people would agree it's fine that the film narratively condemns his worldview. And Darwin's death is a hero sacrifice, so that's a little different. I'm on the fence about the way Eric convinces Raven to stop hiding her true form. He says, "Have you ever looked at a tiger and thought you ought to cover it up?" There's something inherently creepy and maybe more than a little sexist going on here, and I'm not sure if it's intentional or not. After all, Moira's character arc is all about men stigmatizing women, and she relates to mutants being treated differently from everyone else because she's experienced that as a woman working for the CIA. That's why she sides with Charles. So gender prejudice is already a major theme here, this time more prominently addressed with the mutant metaphor, I'd say, than even racial prejudice, even though this historically is smack dab in the middle of the civil rights movement. So we have men treating women as inferior or as objects, but this is the only point where Eric seems to be like that himself. And again, I'm not sure he really means anything by it beyond saying she shouldn't have to hide her true form. The tiger allegory is weird because he's not saying tigers shouldn't have to hide their stripes or something. He's saying you shouldn't have to cover tigers up. He also calls her an exquisite creature. But she's still a person, and civilized people wear clothes. He's wearing clothes. When Beast becomes all blue and furry, Eric tells him he's never looked better and he sincerely means it. But he doesn't tell him to take all his clothes off. Obviously, this wouldn't begin to play the same way if Mystique were a man. So all this awkwardness is created by a fair attempt to explain why Mystique goes around naked in the other films. But we already have at least the practical answer of she can't change shape wearing clothes, and if she's nude, she doesn't have to constantly divide her attention. That makes enough sense to me. But if she's not on a mission or something and doesn't need to be ready to shapeshift at a moment's notice, this idea that she should always go around naked, it doesn't make any sense. She's not hiding her true self by putting on some jeans and a t-shirt. You'd still be able to tell she's all blue and scaly, just like when I'm wearing clothes, you can tell I'm pasty white and geeky looking. I get that she's really into Eric, but I'm surprised she's not at least a little offended at his objectifying her, practically relegating her to a pet, especially because in the very next scene, standing in front of Xavier in the nude, she accuses Xavier of the very same thing. Pets are always cuter when they're little, she says. And that scene has one of my favorite moments, when she transforms into what she thinks she'll look like years later, and it's Rebecca Romaine. What a clever way to do a cameo. It's also really interesting that Mystique joins Magneto and is at least symbolically liberated by taking her clothes off, while Angel joins Magneto for precisely the opposite reason. As a stripper, she feels defined by her body and can't find a way to be viewed as more than a sexual object to men. She's trapped because as a mutant, she feels exactly the same way, defined by her mutant power. I think Angel flips sides a little too quick, but what Shaw says to her cuts to the core. She's tired of being taken advantage of, and that's exactly what she's afraid will happen if she trusts humans over mutants. I don't know if Angel was intended to be a mirror for Mystique, but it's fascinating how they both choose the same side and seem to have such remarkably different feelings about the respective sexualities. At first glance, giving Xavier and Mystique a brother-sister, almost a father-daughter relationship, is more left field than pairing her up with Beast, and it's another creative choice that doesn't completely jive with the other movies, as there's never a sense that Mystique and Xavier have ever met prior to the first X-Men film, and hard to imagine she's so nonchalant about sabotaging Cerebro in the first film, considering she might kill her one-time best friend and the man who raised her. On the other hand, Professor X is an entirely private man, and Mystique is, well, mysterious and good at hiding her emotions. So it's not totally outside of the realm of possibility. And there's such a genuine rapport between James McAvoy and Jennifer Lawrence that I can't imagine this movie without that. Mystique serves as the first mutant Charles Xavier mentors, and early in his life, she's the seed that begins his dream of teaching mutants to control their powers and to therefore prove to humanity that humans and mutants can share the world. You need someone like her that early so that Professor X can become a mentor before he's Professor X. She is philosophically Xavier at the beginning of the film and Eric by the end, though that's a gross oversimplification. Maybe losing her to Magneto is Xavier's saddest and lowest point, as she was his first success, but with the help of Magneto, is also his first failure. I agree with the how it should have ended video on First Class that it's a little hard to swallow and maybe lessens Mystique as a sympathetic character to a degree, that she sides with Magneto against the man she owes everything to right there on that island while Xavier's lying there shot, but that image also serves as an encapsulation of the argument they're destined to have forever and the hypocrisy of Magneto's position. Magneto believes mutant kind can live peacefully as its own society because they're naturally better than humanity, which proves time and time again that it can't even keep the peace within itself, much less with mutant kind. And yet, the only way Magneto knows to prove this is with violence, and starting here, against his own kind. Beginning with killing Shaw for revenge, Eric refuses to be, as Xavier puts it, the better man, because in his words, they already are. In ability, sure, mutants all possess some extraordinary gift normal humans lack. But in behavior, he repeatedly illustrates that mutants are exactly the same while preaching the opposite. He uses the Cuban Missile Crisis, the world's two superpowers ready to make nuclear war with each other, as evidence that humans are inferior, warlike, primal. He even calls humans Neanderthals. Yet, importantly, the first blood he spills, as he announces his plans to create a new mutant society, is mutant blood, Charles Xavier's. That's not on purpose, but it's representative of his inability to create peace within mutant kind while declaring war on humankind, and of his refusal to admit that he has self-improvement to do. He and Xavier will begin a never-ending stalemate, a Cold War of their own, not altogether different from period America and Russia's relationship. Arguably the two most powerful entities on Earth with opposing philosophies, each wanting to make the planet closer to his ideal, and each blocking each other's dreams because of equal, awesome might. Mystique represents Xavier's inability to fulfill his dream. As long as there is a Magneto, some mutants will be swayed to the cynical position of survival of the fittest. And they're going to keep proving to humans that humanity can't trust them. It's so much easier to convince yourself you're already perfect than to work to better yourself. Like Pyro in X2, Mystique is lured to Magneto's side because it's intoxicating to be told something like, you're a god among insects. Being mightier than others and oppressing them because you're different is so much simpler than finding a way to convince people that your physical differences don't change the core elements, choice, intellect, reason, self-awareness, that make humans and mutants more similar than they are dissimilar. Magneto's argument, though I don't think he ever quite articulates it like this, is to accept your primal nature, to let nature decide who is best, who is worst, who should live, and who should die. He arrived at that conclusion because he doesn't believe humanity, based on his own past, capable of making the enlightened choices Xavier does. And so what else is there but genetic superiority? I think the most fascinating idea in the movie is that it's a mutant pretending to be a human who brings about this anti-mutant worldview in Eric. If it wasn't for Sebastian Shaw, a mutant who adopts the methods of the Nazis to build his own mutant regime, he would have never turned out the way he did. The ultimate example of a mutant with all of humanity's fallacies, the biggest one being that ultimate power corrupts absolutely, is precisely the thing that brought Magneto to his belief that mutants are naturally better than humans, and he can't see that. I thought Magneto was a really interesting contradiction before, but First Class adds this extra layer that makes him all the more complex. The trouble with trying to fit Xavier and Magneto's entire friendship, and the demise of that friendship, in one movie, is that it's far more condensed than I would like. That's the nature of the business. I'd rather see this stretched over 2 films or a trilogy, but this was a fairly risky project to begin with. If viewers didn't accept it, if they saw it as too radical of a tonal shift from the other films or just weren't interested in a prequel, we'd be stuck with half or a third of a story that was never finished. The relationship is impressively strong given the time constraints. I don't like that they're only friends for like a couple weeks here, after all of Xavier's talk in the original about how Magneto is his old friend, about how he helped put the school together, helped build Cerebro, very clearly was meant to have actually been there when it was an already full-fledged institution filled with mutant students, and yet their friendship here is believable, their dynamic is warm, and I can't deny that it's incredibly sad when they go their separate ways. I eat up every dialogue exchange these two men have, because Singer and Turner clearly have a lot of reverence for these characters and understand their mutual respect but profoundly different opinions, and you can also see that in Matthew Vaughn's directing. I like how desperate Eric is to make Charles understand him. Charles has been in his head. He knows the man more intimately than anyone else possibly could. He has that wonderful moment where he helps Eric find the balance between rage and serenity. He helps him master his powers, and even after feeling everything Eric has ever felt with him, he still can't be swayed into his pessimism. Xavier does understand Eric, but he also understands humanity because he's read the minds of humans and mutants alike. He sees them as naturally unsure and afraid of what they don't understand, not as naturally inferior, and believes mutants can teach them. It's a matter of communication, making the humans see them and mutants the way he does. That's why I love the moment toward the end, when Magneto, incapable of understanding his friend the way Xavier does him, pleads with Xavier to join him in his cause. He says, "We want the same thing." And Xavier, in possibly the saddest moment of the movie, says, "No, my friend, we do not." And deep down, he's known that from the beginning. But he's the eternal optimist. He believed he could communicate something to Eric, change his mind, the same way he believes he can change humanity's mind about mutants. The very first time I saw this, I had a hard time understanding why Charles was so quick to ignore all the horrible things Eric had done, befriend him, and work with him as equal partners. Eric is a murderer, and he's primarily driven by revenge. But on repeat viewings, I've come to the opinion that Charles is the only person who could see Eric the way he does, because he's been in his mind and experienced what he's experienced. If Charles had gone through everything Eric had, he might have turned out the same way, and he's empathetic toward that. Rather than choosing not to trust him solely on the basis of his extreme actions, Xavier does what he did with Raven and what he'll do with his school. He takes in a lost and shunned mutant, helps him learn how to use his powers, teaches him his philosophy, and then lets him go his own way. I like how thoughtfully the movie handles this, trying to realistically depict how telepathy would alter how someone viewed another person, and the large role it would play in their interpersonal chemistry. But while I generally find myself agreeing with Charles' methods over Eric's, and after all, Magneto might be a sympathetic villain, but he's certainly intended to be seen, when it's all said and done, as a villain, Charles isn't perfect any more than Eric is, and I really appreciate his moral ambiguity at the end because it illustrates how neither man's philosophy can be fully implemented in reality. As I said, Magneto is a walking contradiction, but Xavier has his own hypocrisy. In one scene, he refuses to use his mind control to force Eric to come with him, wanting him to make up his own mind. He doesn't want to control and manipulate. That's what Shaw does, the way he manipulates America and Russia into the Cuban Missile Crisis. And yet, he will change a person's mind on minor things when it suits him, like when he forces the CIA agent in charge of Hank's lab to drive him there. That scene is played for comedy, but there are certainly implications. His ideology is entirely founded on trusting humans who may not have done anything to deserve it. Yet he wipes Moira's mind at the end so she won't know about his school, and she has done everything to deserve his trust. This is consistent with the other films. Xavier will make the hard ethical choice when he thinks it's necessary for the safety of his fellow mutants. And that makes us ask the question, how different are Magneto and Xavier really? And when I look at them in that way, it's really no wonder they're such fast friends. Both are strong leaders, passionate about mutant rights, both willing to get their hands dirty to change the status quo, but neither has it all figured out yet. As an audience, we tend to side with Xavier because he's the positive idealist, and because, we're all humans and not mutants, and we'd hate to live in a world where Magneto was in charge, where we'd all either get turned into mutants who can't hold their molecular cohesion, or else get killed by a brain-splitting ringing in our brains. But I do appreciate that Xavier isn't portrayed as the perfect, can-do-no-wrong hero either. If this was all black and white, we would never buy the friendship. I should also mention that Fassbender and McAvoy are brilliant together. McAvoy really feels like a young Patrick Stewart to me, and I have no trouble imagining him growing up into the Xavier from the other films. Fassbender's Eric isn't exactly what McKellen was doing, but they don't feel like different characters either. Again, one's just seasoned and hardened. In the Magneto, decades after he killed the man responsible for his whole negative worldview, would be entirely different from the Magneto fueled by singular vengeance, whereas Xavier doesn't have that one defining moment in his past, no single loose end to tie up before he can become the man he wants to be. And we don't see such a dramatic change in the character. Before the movie came out, I was worried it might be a letdown to see other actors playing these roles in a film that finally concentrates totally on them, and I didn't experience that at all. I felt like I was seeing Xavier and Eric, and the actors totally fell away. Equally brilliant in his role is Kevin Bacon as Sebastian Shaw, a real surprise treat in casting, and a villain I never thought I'd find nearly as fascinating as William Stryker. Speaking of, I like that Stryker's dad is such a bigot in this. The apple didn't fall far from the tree. Anyway, I see Shaw as the proto-Magneto, represented by his being the first to wear the helmet, and he's everything Magneto wants to be, but also doesn't want to be all rolled into one. He's the extreme Magneto would never go to, the proof that mutants are just as horrible as humans, because he uses despicable Nazi tactics to get what he wants. I like how Eric makes himself analogous to Frankenstein's monster. Beast, as Jekyll to Hyde, creates his own monster, but Magneto had one forced onto himself, and both men find it impossible to move beyond their natures. Shaw created him, a weapon as he calls himself, by teaching him to tap into his rage and control his power, beginning with killing his mother. Eric agrees with Shaw's assessment that mutants are the next step in evolution and have surpassed humans, but he doesn't agree with his methods, the way he hurts his own kind, and the way he hurt his family. Interestingly, Shaw at one point early on even tells Emma Frost they don't hurt their own kind. But he's lying. He presents himself to his followers as exactly what Magneto will eventually become, the leader of a brotherhood, mutants rising up against humans. In truth, he sees himself as even above mutants. Shaw sees himself as a god, and he manipulates both races to put himself on top. Eric kills Shaw with the very coin he tried to force Eric to move as a boy, when he killed his mother for not being able to display his power. It's poetic justice, but more than that, the coin is, I think, symbolic of the two sides that will soon be at war, humanity and mutant kind. Shaw is, for Eric, both human and mutant. Again, the man who represents the cruelty he's experienced under the thumb of oppressive human beings, but also the man who first unlocked his gifts. When he decides to embrace the rage instead of the balance, he throws away the coin to destroy everything he hates most in the world. There is no balance for Magneto. Humans are bad, mutants are good, and they don't belong together on the same coin. Charles, like Shaw, is also a coin, but a man who represents the best of humanity and mutant kind rather than the worst. Eric believes only in mutants, and that's why he can't work with Charles. He nearly kills Charles in the process because he can't see the potential harmony of the two sides. But it's also Charles who helps him master his powers, the new positive mentor, the better man who takes Shaw's place and tries to show Eric how to be a better man himself. If only he hadn't thrown away the coin. He's already chosen a side. His world is black and white, and thus, at the end, he wears a costume that makes him look like the devil. Though he isn't as evil as Shaw, he has, to a degree, become what he hates the most, because of his refusal to look for that balance. When I reviewed X2, I talked about Magneto and Stryker's opposing philosophies, with Xavier in the middle, human versus mutant, and sandwiched in between is Xavier's ideal of human and mutant. In this movie, and this is ironic because humanity at large isn't even aware of mutants yet, we've got two of those triangles, and they're all about mutants, with opposing philosophies and a more balanced one in the middle. There's the triangle of control. On one end, there's Shaw, who wants to be master of the universe, a mutant who's even better than all the other mutants. On the other side, there's Xavier, who doesn't believe mutants are better than humans. And then in the middle, there's Magneto, who believes mutants are better than humans, but not that he's any better than any other mutant. Did you ever think you'd see Magneto as the balance in any equation? Magneto there is put between two mentors and forced to develop a third path. Paralleling that is the romantic triangle I mentioned earlier, but besides the romance, it's also about ideology. On the one end is Magneto. This time he is on one end of the spectrum, and he says mutants should embrace what they are and not hide their gifts. On the other side of that is Hank, who doesn't even want to be a mutant. Then in the middle is Mystique, who starts out like Hank and then ends up like Magneto, so she goes from one side to the other. I don't know if this is by design, but it's interesting that the two characters in the middle of each of these triangles come to similar conclusions, and they even join forces in the end. In X2, Xavier was the calm middle ground, but here, among his own kind, he's perhaps an unrealistic idealist. The two mutants he cares about and has the most respect for don't believe in his cause by the end, and besides Moira McTaggart, he has no reason beyond faith to believe his dream can be realized. Shaw's presence and his history with Magneto show that there's a worse extreme even beyond Magneto's. For the purpose of the story, makes it easier for the audience to care about him and see a real argument between him and Xavier rather than just immediately siding with Xavier. Shaw serves to challenge both Xavier and Eric's positions. Mutants aren't automatically the better men if they act like the worst of humans. But if humans can be so easily manipulated to destroy each other, what hope does Xavier have of helping them live in peace with humans? This is such a dense film, and there are a dozen other topics I'd love to go as in-depth with, but this is already a massive review, so I'll just touch on a few other points here in conclusion. The one casting choice I don't care for is January Jones's Emma Frost, and I know I'm not alone in this. I think she comes off as too flaky and not independent and present enough for the role. I get the sense that her casting had something to do with her role in Mad Men. She's brilliant there, by the way. She's used to playing in a 60s period setting, but she comes off as too subservient to Shaw because her performance isn't separated enough from how she plays Betty Draper. Again, that sexist prejudice is a theme in the film, and she and Shaw have to play that, but the Emma Frost I knew from the comics is a master manipulator in her own right. She would only let Shaw treat her like that until she found the right moment to turn the tables on him, and I think that characterization would have been more interesting than what we got here. The character itself is a little wasted. She's mostly just here so Xavier has someone to battle telepathically, though I like Magneto's line at the end that he needs someone to fill that void. Speaking of telepathy, I don't have a problem with Shaw wearing the helmet before Magneto, and I like it symbolically, but how it was built makes no sense. Shaw says the Russians built it for him. How would the Russians, knowing nothing about mutant powers, know what material to make a helmet out of to keep out telepathy? I suppose they could have studied Emma Frost's powers, but that's clearly not what happened because Shaw introduces the helmet to Emma, who clearly knew nothing about it, and I'd assume Shaw is pretty selective about who gets to know their mutants. One of the biggest criticisms fans lob against the film is how quickly Darwin is killed off and that he is another token black guy who has the obligatory sacrificial death. I completely agree with that. The death serves a purpose, but the character is pretty much a prop. Even Banshee and Havoc are more realized, and their purposes are mostly practical, helping to get the team from point A to point B, and they're examples of mutants who need help mastering their powers. Darwin's power is adapting to survive, and he's the first X-Man in history to get killed. That's there to establish just how powerful Shaw is, and I think to illustrate his ideals as opposed to Magneto's. He believes he is superior to other mutants, and by destroying a mutant whose power is evolution, he arrogantly shows how much more advanced he thinks he is even over mutant evolution at large. He sees himself as the ultimate mutant, the end of the line. His power to absorb energy keeps him young, so he thinks he can keep this up forever. I suppose in X3 he would have been considered a Class 5. I also never questioned this until First Class, but if other mutants need Xavier's help in mastering their powers, how did he learn to master his? That's never addressed in any film, and he's one of the most powerful mutants in existence, so you'd think he'd be just as much in need of guidance as anyone. Shaw, also obviously one of, if not the most powerful of mutants, also seems to have mastered his abilities all by himself. I don't get it. X-Men First Class is a smart, thought-provoking, engaging movie with distinct and fascinating characters which paints a vivid picture of the complex tapestry of the ethical conundrum X-Men was built on. How do we all, with our varying abilities, disabilities, beliefs, and prejudices, all live in the same world together? It further convolutes the mythology of this world, but it has some of the best character study and social commentary in superhero films I've ever seen, and I like it almost as much as I like X2. Therefore, I'm giving X-Men First Class a 3.5 out of 4. And next time, for the first time, I'm going to review another movie by the same director, and it'll be Kick-Ass. Stay tuned. Bye.